From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capital Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of the Capital Research Center.
This is our podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. We do it so you don't have to. And I'm going to start off with a look at the fake news issue, which according to the Washington Post is basically what got Donald Trump elected president and defeated Hillary Clinton. And the Washington Post did an article, an expose, in which they exposed a sophisticated, this is a quote, a sophisticated Russian propaganda campaign that created and spread misleading articles online with the goal of punishing Democrat Hillary Clinton, helping Republican Donald Trump, and undermining faith in American democracy. And my favorite part of this was it characterized these stories that were being spread by the right wing. And the right wing were spreading these stories across the internet that, quote, portrayed Clinton as a criminal, hiding potentially fatal health problems, and preparing to hand control of the nation to a shadowy cabal of global financiers. Which kind of sounds to me like what the truth was.
What's the controversy there?
Yeah, I know. It's amazing that, of course, when Hillary had her collapse during the ceremony regarding 9/11.
Which collapse was that?
Yeah, well, that was one of her collapses. And then that was the moment, I think, when people realized that the Clinton campaign had been lying about her health problems. And then the other moment, and of course the media played this down as much as they could, was that, remember, Hillary told the FBI she couldn't remember things about, for example, when she was briefed about security procedures as Secretary of State. She couldn't remember these things because, she had that brain injury where she hit her head and she had a blood clot on the brain. Now, when people like Karl Rove, and I'm no fan of Karl Rove, but Karl Rove, when he mentioned at one point earlier that he believed that Hillary had suffered a traumatic brain injury, he was ripped into by the media, including even a panel on Fox News that ripped into him for spreading these vile, vicious rumors, which of course she then confirmed.
How dare he?
And
a point that I like to make is that a lot of people don't seem to realize that she suffered a concussion. A concussion, by definition, is a traumatic brain injury. It is brain damage. The question then becomes, is it permanent or is it temporary? But she did suffer brain damage.
Right, and it was beyond, as we later learned, beyond even a concussion, which you're right, that alone would have been a traumatic brain injury, but the fact that she had a blood clot on the brain and then later claimed significant memory loss from that. So that's one of those things. So I guess that was just part of the stuff we were making up, was that she had these terrible health problems,
remember, she did brag about during the debates with Donald Trump. She did brag, or after them, she did brag. Well, who says I don't have stamina? I stood up there for hours arguing with Donald Trump. And remember when she appeared in front of the Benghazi Select Committee on Capitol Hill? What was it? 11 hours straight of testimony? Well, that's proof that she has stamina.
Ah, yes, very strong. Well, the other thing that's mentioned in here, one of them, is that she was portrayed by right-wingers as a criminal. My goodness, who'd have thought that Hillary would be a criminal just because she stole 66,000 government documents, put them on her private server, and then in order to cover up a pay-for-play operation involving people who would come to meet with her at the State Department, for example, and pay her husband off with $750,000 speaking fees. The people who came to the State Department to meet her, according to the Associated Press, in the 2 years for which they were able to find records, 55% of them that met with her, who were from the private sector or the non-governmental organizations and nonprofits and so on. Those people, 55% of them were contributors to the Clinton Foundation. That's an amazing coincidence. And by the way, we're not talking about those little things where you send in $50 a month. We're talking about $1.5 million on average for these people who were contributors to the Clinton Foundation, buying access to the Secretary of State and, they thought, the future president. So, the idea that of course, her criminality, and I would encourage any of our listeners to go and see a story that I did on our website called The Clinton Method, where I actually went back to 1978 and showed that the methods that the Clintons used to cover up their criminality have been in use by them going back that far, going back to actually starting 3 weeks before Bill was even elected governor of Arkansas. That's when they started. In that case, Hillary was laundering payoffs from polluters in Arkansas through a commodities account so that it looked like she had turned $1,000 into $100,000 in that commodities account. So anyway, so these are all crazy right-wing stories that have no basis other than actual facts. And we've learned from the Washington Post this week that these are the sort of things that were made up and were what got Donald Trump elected. Some of the things, by the way, that I consider fake news that came out during this campaign. The Miss Universe claiming that he had called her Miss Housekeeping, which, as we revealed on our website, that never happened. Donald Trump inviting Russians to hack into our computer systems, which
never happened.
Which never happened. It was repeated. Both of those things were, by the way, mentioned by Hillary during the debate, were debating points. And you could just go through one after another the things that that Donald Trump was accused of that never in fact happened. But hey, that's not fake news because that was reported in real news sources like the Washington Post and the New York Times.
Well, a topic that's been in the news a lot lately has been Trump derangement syndrome, how a lot of left-wingers and other Hillary Clinton supporters are actually in a state of panic right now. They're experiencing panic attacks, actual anxiety. And I was speaking with a friend of mine last night who I don't wish to name, but he knows a psychiatrist who is a Clinton supporter and is actually being overwhelmed with requests for appointments from like-minded people who can barely sleep at night thinking about the horrors that await the nation January 20th at 12 noon when the evil Donald Trump gets sworn in with the diabolical Mike Pence at his side as vice president and president of the United States. So it's causing a tremendous uptick in psychiatry and psychological appointments for people to deal with these terrors that they're having. And I feel so sorry for these people, and it's just a terrible thing. And what can we do? Like, maybe we should start a fundraising drive, like on NPR.
Well, we certainly have to protect the snowflakes that go to our colleges because they had their professors cancel exams or make exams be optional in the wake of this horror of Donald Trump winning the election. And look, here's what happened.
Did you know he's never been elected to office before?
Really?
Yes.
I did not know that. The reason that people reacted, and there were a lot of people, I know people who reacted with horror. They were told one thing after another about Donald Trump that wasn't true. And this is the only way. The only way you could get anybody to vote for someone as flawed, as dangerous as Hillary Clinton would be to make her opponent more dangerous and more flawed. And so Donald Trump, who in 36 years or more in the real estate business in New York, had never been seen as a racist or an anti-Semite. I remember just recently I saw an episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air with special guest star Donald Trump, and it was all about what a great guy Donald Trump was. Apparently this racist thing wasn't known, I guess, then. And of course he was this anti-Semite, even though his daughter is Jewish, and he was involved, obviously, in New York with a lot of people who were Jewish in the real estate business, and somehow this it just never occurred to them that he was like this, because of course this was all made up. There were even some writers. The writer from Slate magazine, the principal political writer, actually wrote an article about a year and a half ago about how Donald Trump was unlikely to be the Republican nominee because he was just too moderate. And then the same writer writes an article after the election about how Trump is basically the new Hitler. And so,
well, speaking of Hitler and overusing accusations that somebody's Hitler, the Southern Poverty Law Center has a new report out called The Trump Effect, in which it claims to have surveyed thousands of school teachers across the nation, and who to thunk it, they also are terrified, and their students are terrified about the incoming Trump administration, and they want to help teachers cope with the so-called Trump effect and they want to encourage them to teach their students to resist Donald Trump, to identify him, to name him as their enemy, and so that they can fight him. And this is the same Southern Poverty Law Center that's been saying that there's a Ku Klux Klansman under every bed for the last few decades, even though there's only a handful of those losers left, mostly old, fat, toothless guys living in their grandmother's basements. Or their mother's basements, and they've hyped this sort of thing for years, and they've actually taken a lot of heat even from people on the left, like The Nation, which has called them a bunch of scam artists and hucksters. So,
yeah, the Southern Poverty Law Center is something that I go back many years with.
Because you're from Alabama.
I'm from Alabama originally, and of course that's where they were based. And I remember when that was a perfectly legitimate group, when they did great work exposing people like the Ku Klux Klan. But now they've just descended into this panic organization. Hundreds of reports of Islamophobia, and then you start looking into individual cases, and you find out that at least half of them are where you can determine whether they happened or not are made up, and they're often things like someone reporting that they were in line at a coffee shop, and someone maybe noticed that they were wearing the clothing associated with Islam, and that someone would then make an anti-Muslim comment. And it's just one person's word, and it may be true. But the thing is, they're putting that in the same category as the things that were done, the real horrors that occurred. And I remember these from my childhood during the days of the civil rights movement in the South, when you would take, the Klan types would take voter registration workers, and they would put them into landfills, and you cannot compare those two. And to just have a list of hundreds of these things, and then you check into them and you find out they're not really real, or they're so insignificant. It's just sad. One of the things that the Southern Poverty Law Center was responsible for was this terrorist who attacked the Family Research Council, and now that's a social conservative group.
You're talking about the assailant was Floyd Corkins?
Yeah, and had Chick-fil-A sandwiches, and his intention was to kill everybody there, and then put a Chick-fil-A sandwich on them. That was a reference to how one of the officials of Chick-fil-A had expressed support for, or opposition, I should say, to same-sex marriage, and that therefore Chick-fil-A was this terrible, monstrous organization associated with Christians, and he was going to kill everybody there and drop these Chick-fil-A sandwiches on them. Fortunately, there was, I believe, a security guard who stopped him and saved the day.
And who took a bullet in doing so, but he survived.
Yeah, and of course the left then tried to say this wasn't a terrorist attack when it met the definition, obviously, of a terrorist attack. When you attack people for their political views, that's one of the definitions of a terrorist attack. But this is what in the Southern Poverty Law Center never really took responsibility for that. They never dialed it back. They dialed it up, and they only dialed it up even more as we got through this political.
And they're really all about fundraising. They do relatively little considering how much money they have. The last time I researched the Southern Poverty Law Center, they had more than $1/3 of $1 billion in assets. Okay, it was more than $330 million, which is just obscene for a relatively inactive nonprofit like that. And they also have suspicious bank accounts offshore. I think one of the countries was the Cayman Islands. So you have to wonder, unless they're doing missionary work, why are they stashing all that money down there? And why do they need all that money? Shouldn't they be using it to further their cause instead of just stockpiling it?
Yeah,
it's a very suspicious, sleazy organization. And which shouldn't surprise anyone, because it was started by a big con man named Morris Dees, a civil rights lawyer.
All right, and who was the fundraiser for the McGovern campaign in 1972, so has long been involved in Democratic Party left-wing politics. The thing about the Southern Poverty Law Center and groups like that is they mainly serve to provide a quote to the news media. So you'll have a reporter who wants to say something about the people that reporter disagrees with, and can always go to the Southern Poverty Law Center and find the quote. And that's how they get their publicity. And then people see people who are potential contributors to that sort of thing. They see the name on the TV screen in the newspaper, and they hear it, and that's the group then that they contribute to. And they keep doing this even long after the group has outlived its useful purpose, its legitimate purpose. Part of the reaction to Trump has been, and that we've seen on college campuses, as we've referred to earlier. Hampshire College, you may have heard, they took down the American flag from the campus because they didn't want to offend the students. They wanted to have a safe space where the students wouldn't be exposed to something as offensive as the American flag. Of course, this is in a town where they fly the UN flag over City Hall, and where the city council voted to impeach President George W. Bush. Now, of course, the irony is, I haven't looked it up, but I'm guessing that they voted to impeach him over the Iraq War, which, of course, Hillary Clinton supported. So it just shows you the flexibility of the left. They can flip on a dime. But that was a terrible, terrible thing that was subject to their vote for impeachment of George W. Bush in the town there, because it was such a terrible thing that he was such a terrible president, that led to the flag burning discussion, because you've had people burning flags in some of these protests, and of course Donald Trump came out and said that he believed that people should go to prison, go to jail for a year, or have their citizenship revoked if they got caught burning the flag. Now, I don't happen to agree with that. I'm more of a First Amendment absolutist than that, as was Justice Scalia, of course, is the fellow who wrote the opinion which said that burning the flag, as offensive and disgusting as it is covered under the First Amendment. It is part of free speech. But what was really interesting in the way that the media covered this issue was that for a long time, now eventually they got forced into it by criticism, but for a long time they didn't mention the position that other people had taken on this flag burning thing. It was only Donald Trump who's trying to take away your First Amendment rights. That Donald Trump, he really doesn't believe in freedom of speech. And then finally they got around to pointing out that Hillary Clinton, in fact, had sponsored legislation to outlaw flag burning, to put people in jail for flag burning, $100,000 fine for flag burning.
Would the flag burners be considered super predators?
I don't know. Which, of course, was the thing that Hillary had, and the Clinton administration had talked about back in the 90s. That got them in some trouble with the Black Lives Matter people. Was the reference to super predators in our nation's cities. But here, and in fact, 48 of the 50 states did have laws against flag burning at the time the Supreme Court struck it down. So again, I disagree with that position, but it's certainly not a nutty position. It's not one where you're waging war on the First Amendment if you take that position. And yet they presented Donald Trump that way, and then only later were they forced into mentioning that Hillary Clinton and a lot of other people had taken the same position.
Right. Now, switching to a different topic, I've been reading lately that top Hillary Clinton aide Huma Abedin, who has scary ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, but that's not at issue here, that Huma Abedin is living, again, with her husband, sleazeball, former Congressman Anthony Weiner. This is the man who likes to send pictures of his wiener over the internet to other to women who, for some reason, actually respond to this fellow.
Well, remember, there are always women who want to marry Charles Manson or other, and serial killers.
Right.
Some women, they're attracted to fellows.
Well,
like
he's
that.
also being investigated by child custody services in the city of New York. We sent out a picture while he was engaged in one of these sexting conversations, and there's his little boy sitting beside him on the bed, and it's so creepy. It's hard to believe, but these are left-wingers, so I guess we have to believe it. At the time, things were really building up. This was during the summer. This was in late August, and Huma Abedin was constantly in the news. She had been testifying regarding the Clinton email scandal and related topics. And the separation that they announced at the very end of August always struck me as a little too convenient. It was too cute. This is a woman who's a hardcore political animal, as is her husband, former Congressman Weiner.
Who was the youngest person ever elected to the New York City Council, for example.
Right. So he's a keener. This is not a guy who's like going to go away easily. He's not going to fade into the night too easily, as demonstrated by his run, I guess it was 2 years ago, unsuccessful run for mayor of the city of New York. I was thinking at the time that the breakup may have been staged. I know that sounds like a wacky conspiracy theory, but Hillary Clinton is so calculating. I would not be surprised if she asked the two to pretend to separate in order. And you remember Huma Abedin said at the time, "I wish at this time that the press would respect our privacy." It was a way to deflect criticism and to take the focus off of Huma Abedin. And Clinton hoped, and I guess she gambled and lost, that reporters were going to stop talking about the email server scandal. So, was the breakup fake? I don't know.
Well, the thing about that is, and this is something that anybody who's around politics long enough realizes, and that is a lot of people's personal lives that's presented to the public is just fake. And you usually we'll see this in the case of, say, the Clintons or FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, people who, in case of married couples, people who had been separated for decades even, and yet presented themselves as a loving couple. If you remember the case of during the various Clinton scandals when they staged these pictures of Bill on the beach with Hillary dancing with her,
it's just that everlasting love affair.
Right, exactly. And anybody who knows them knows that it's totally fake. And and so I absolutely have no. I'm not saying that it's true or not true. The fact that there are these reports that they're back together if they were ever separated. If you look at the movie, there's a very good documentary called Weiner. It's playing on, I believe it's HBO now.
So now we can all look at Weiner?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's great.
And what it shows is that the guy is a pathological liar, and there are instances in this. In this movie, which is very well done. There are instances where you see him lying almost for no reason, just sort of lying to be lying, something where he's going to get caught within a few minutes of telling the lie, and yet he persists in the lie. And is there something in the psychology of someone like Huma Abedin that attracts her to an Anthony Weiner and a Hillary Clinton? Remember, these are the two the main people in her life, at least adults, are pathological liars.
Maybe there's a codependency problem there.
Yeah. It's something, and it is a common problem in politics. The number of people that I can think of in politics who just lie for the sake of lying, although obviously very few rise to the level or sink to the level of Hillary Clinton and Anthony Weiner. And by the way, Anthony Weiner was a very important part of the Clinton political operation. The intention was, before he got caught up in all this scandal stuff, was that he was going to be the mayor of New York, and he probably would have been the mayor of New York. Remember, when he got into the mayor's race, even after the first wave of the scandal, he was still the front runner for a while. So had there been no scandal, most likely he would have been elected mayor of New York, and that would have put New York City under the direct control of the Clinton organization, just as the state of Virginia is now with Terry McAuliffe, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chair and is generally considered, one of the top operatives in the Clinton
It's
organization.
amazing he hasn't been indicted for racketeering, isn't it?
Oh, and I've written many times, and we can talk about it on a later program, of the various things that particularly involving the Chinese, that Terry McAuliffe has been involved in, the various scandals that he's been involved in, and some involving Hillary's brother. So let me one other thing this week that was really, really bad, and that was the praise for Castro. There was a group, Campus Reform, that went down and filmed students at American University, which is just a few blocks from us here in Washington, and asked students who did they like better? Did they like Castro better or Donald Trump? And of course, the reaction was that most of them liked Castro better. And this is a man who was one of the great mass murderers who, in the Soviet Empire, his role was to send the troops. He would take his own young men from his country and he would send them to countries in Africa, in South America, and around the world. And they would be the troops of the Soviet Empire. They would die on the front lines, and he didn't care. And he presided over a country where, well, right now people make on average about $20 a month. And of course, the Obama administration had just opened up Cuba to trade with America, which means essentially American companies being able to take advantage of slave labor in Cuba, as they are able to take advantage of slave labor in China and in Vietnam and in other communist countries. Really, just an outrage. And these people are rightly concerned about taking the names off of buildings of people who made money from the slave business in the United States, and I actually support that. But they're doing it right now, and nobody seems to notice, which is that we're having companies. I mean, I love that my iPhone is cheap, but my iPhone is cheap largely because of slave labor in China. And you have Colin Kaepernick, at the of the 49ers. This is the latest outrage from him, and that is wearing a shirt with Castro on it. And you had people.
Colin Kaepernick just seems to have a knack for doing the wrong thing every time. He's very much like President Obama in a way.
Yeah, just a horrible, horrible person. And, what do you do about somebody like that? But you also had quotes like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada. That's the land from which you hail.
Canada.
Yes. Canada. And he called Castro a remarkable leader with tremendous dedication and love for the Cuban people. And the Secretary General of the United Nations called him a strong voice for social justice. This is a guy who
that part is accurate because social justice is evil.
Well, that's true. That's true. And here's a guy who put gays in concentration camps, that sort of thing. It just absolutely amazing. And the way the left covers these things up, as we were talking before. I remember in the 80s there was an effort there was a plan to show a documentary in Washington, in Georgetown, at a theater there that I often went there to see my movies, and the documentary was about Castro's mistreatment of gays, and just horrific in ways beyond imagining. And the leftists in Washington blocked that from being shown. They managed to keep that ever from being shown. It was a little bit of a controversy back in the 80s about that, but they kept it out. They censored it, and that's what because Castro's always their guy, isn't he?
It's amazing how much the residual love is there among even relatively mainstream figures on the left, like the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. Put out a gushing tribute to Castro when he died and hailed him for all of his alleged accomplishments. And even Obama couldn't say very much about him in a somewhat diplomatic statement that he made when Cuba announced that Fidel Castro was dead. He acknowledged that there were controversies and that Castro, had some problems, but he didn't come out and condemn him. And it was really refreshing to see President-elect Trump condemn him immediately as a brutal dictator. That was a nice thing to see, and it's something that we haven't heard out of the White House for the last 8 years.
Yeah, well, in fact, they're sending officials to the funeral. Ben Rhodes is going. Now, Ben Rhodes, of course, was the fellow who came up with the fake Benghazi talking points, who happens to be the brother of the president of CBS News. And so you can start to see all the connections.
And he also masterminded the plot to get the agreement, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Pact, the bungled and botched Nuclear Non-Proliferation Pact, with the Islamic Republic of Iran through, that we know is not enforceable, and that is only going to make it easier for the mullahs of Tehran to get their hands on nuclear weapons that will allow them to menace Israel and possibly American interests.
Okay. Well, that's
So
our-
he seems like the perfect guy to send to Cuba.
Absolutely. Well, that's our show for this week. And we look forward to having you hear our show next week. We'll be back then and weekly after that, and we hope you'll join us. Please follow us at the Capital Research Center on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, and at Capital Research on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum. See you next time.
Thanks for listening.